Well, thanks everybody for coming. This is really going to be an informal presentation. I'm here for you guys. I've done probably 800 septic system replacements in my day. That probably ages me quite a bit. But what I've found, a lot of people think, well, the septic system is working fine. It doesn't back up, doesn't break out on the ground. I'm not going to do anything about it. And then you make a decision, well, we're thinking of moving. So you start looking around, you find a place, maybe a condominium, maybe some kind of a townhouse. You put a down payment on it, never expecting to have a problem with your septic. You hire somebody to come in and lo and behold, it's failed. Now you're stuck. You've got money down, you're faced with replacing an expensive septic system. You may have even sold the house before you had a Title V, thinking it wasn't going to be a problem. Now you've sold the house, now you're going to have to spend some money on a septic system. You should have replaced that septic and got more money for your house. So the very last and most important issue is, if you replace your failed septic system while you're living there, you're eligible to up to 40% of the cost back. If you've sold your house, you replace the septic and you move out, you don't get any of that money back. And that's a shame, and I hear that from a lot of people, especially over the last 5 years. Ever since Title V was revised in '95, the state has offered up to $6,000 back on the cost of the septic, and that includes the testing, the engineering, as well as the construction. So a lot of people are foregoing that. So my hope is that after hearing this talk, you folks will think about maybe addressing your septic system. We're going to go over a lot of the issues here. I'm here with my partner, Eric Dickinson. Stand up and take a bow, will you, Eric? And also with us today is Holliston's Board of Health agent, Scott Mowers. He's brought some handouts as well, and he'll get a chance to speak in a minute as well. So let's get started, and as I said, feel free to ask questions as we go along. This is really kind of an informal presentation, and it's for you folks. I titled it Dig a Hole and Bury Your Money in It, because that's a lot of what it is, especially if you're not taking care of your system now. Let's go to the next one. Let's do a little bit of Septic 101. I don't expect you guys to become experts or really care about it, but you need to know what a basic septic system is, so that when you get to the point where you decide to have a Title V inspection, you'll know what the inspector's talking about. You'll be able to ask questions and satisfy yourself that yes, you've passed, or no, you haven't. So a typical septic system contains several components, and we call them typical, but they're not always typical. So all the wastewater in the house goes into the pipes and goes out into this so-called septic tank. I'm sure most of you have heard of that. Inside the septic tank, the idea is that it separates the liquids from the solids. Some solids float, some settle. Over time, the bacteria in a septic tank will degrade all those solids, and you end up with what's called sludge on the bottom. Over time, as that sludge builds up and you get less storage capacity because the sludge is taking up the area that the water should take, you begin to get what's called carryover, and some of the solids will go out the pipe and then go into this component right here, the distribution box. All right, so again, typically the septic tank takes all the wastewater. It should be big enough to separate the liquids from the solids. The liquids go out into a distribution box, and the distribution box then spreads the wastewater over various kinds of designs. Typically in Holliston in the old days, it was a drain field that was stone and perforated pipe. And then the wastewater goes through the pipe, out into the stone, and then goes down into the subsoil and eventually into the groundwater. And it's the groundwater that the state has decided in '95 that the old septic system designs weren't protecting the groundwater. Typically, septic systems were designed with soil testing done in the summer when groundwater was low, and we'll get into that sort of thing later. And then in the wintertime, the groundwater comes up, the septic systems are a foot from the groundwater or even in the groundwater, and the wastewater isn't properly treated, so the environment gets polluted. That's why now you see under the new regulations, your neighbor may have a mound that's 4 foot out of the ground with a white pipe. That's all due to this groundwater issue, which we'll get into a little later. Okay, next slide. So the question comes up, all right, so we've been living there for 20 years. How often should I pump my septic system? And, you know, it's interesting. Every house is different. Every household is different. Sometimes it's just one person. Sometimes it's a family with 3 teenage daughters and a garbage grinder. That's disaster. So it varies. But all of this information, by the way, is straight from the state regulations and the state DEP website. So I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I'll give you the party line. So if you're selling a house, you have to have a Title V inspection. Unless, and this is not in Title V, if you sell to a cash buyer and they don't need a mortgage, they can buy it without doing a Title V inspection. That very rarely happens, and it's usually for a buyer who's a developer who's interested in tearing the house down and doing something totally different. If you do that, of course, you're going to get a lot less money because there's no way of estimating the cost, so they're going to give you the highest price that they think it might cost for the replacement septic. Also, if there's a drastic change in use and you need to go to the building department for a permit, the building department's going to ask the Board of Health their opinion on what's being proposed. And finally, if you're expanding your home, the Board of Health's going to want to know where that addition's going to make sure you're not building on top of your septic system, which of course is a problem. The other thing that isn't mentioned here, most people don't know where their leaching field is. And as a result, they end up planting a tree right in the middle of it. And I see that all the time now. And the first thing they tell me is how great this tree is and how fast it's growing. And please, we don't want to affect it, but it's gone. Next slide. So in order to have a Title V inspection done, you need to hire somebody who's been pre-qualified by the state, has taken the tests, and hopefully is familiar with our area. You know, my advice to you is, first of all, if you have a regular person pumping your septic system, somebody that's been doing it for years, that's where you want to start. Usually they're also system inspectors. They know your system, they know you, they know the history of the system. They can do the best job of doing an inspection for you. According to Title V, professional engineers are also qualified to do system inspections, registered sanitarians, and certified health officers. The second part of a Title V inspection has to do with soil evaluators, and I'll get to that next. So guidance for you. Again, the state says they're currently designed to protect the environment. They want to protect the environment, and so the inspections are geared to find those old systems that don't protect the environment, in their opinion, and replace them, which is one of the reasons they provide an incentive, that $6,000, for you to replace a failed septic now rather than later. A good Title V inspector will go to the town and do some research on your files, see what's available, also look at what was done, any inspections done on either side of you, or across the street, or residents behind. That helps to determine soil types and whether there's any history of failures, and maybe even where the seasonal high groundwater is. They'll also ask you about your water use, how many people living in the house, how many bedrooms do you say you have. All that has to be checked against the town records. Next step. So getting back to the original slide, when a septic inspector comes to town, comes to your house to inspect, he's required to open the covers to the septic tank. The new ones have 3 covers, the old ones typically have 2. One is over the inlet pipe and one is over the outlet pipe. And the reason they do that, within the tank, they're either called baffles or T's. And on old tanks, sometimes these baffles or T's fall off. Typically, a pumper will just open one of the covers and pump out your tank. He won't notice if the inlet T has fallen off, which isn't a big deal. But if the outlet T falls off, or the outlet baffle, then the stuff in the septic tank that floats is going to go out. And it's going to go into the distribution box here. And one of the things a Title V inspector will look for when he opens that distribution box, and he's required to do that as part of the inspection, he'll see what's called solids carryover. Instead of just gray water in there, he's going to see stuff. And that stuff has probably gone out into the pipes, and then it's gone through the pipes and settled in the bottoms of the pipes where the holes are to let the water out. So that starts to plug the holes. Eventually, the water starts to back up. It won't go out into the system, backs up into the tank, and then it backs up in the slop sink in the basement, or if you've got a basement toilet, suddenly that's not working. You can often tell this in advance. You'll notice that maybe the sink drain doesn't drain as fast as it used to. That's a sign that the septic system isn't taking as much water as it should. The other thing is when the soils and the stone gets plugged up, more of the wastewater goes up, and you start to see those green stripes that Irma Bombeck talks about in her book. It's always greener over the septic system, and that's because the water's not going down. Any questions so far? Okay. On occasion, again, because people don't always know where the septic system is, they'll build a patio over a septic tank, or they'll plant a tree in it, as I said earlier, or they'll build some other structure on top of the D-box, and the inspector can't always get in there. What he'll do on that case now, they have cameras with a long tube, and they'll probe through the system to try and find out where your system is. The Board of Health records for systems built prior to '78 are pretty slim, so if you're in an older home here and haven't done anything, the inspector may have to do that. Next slide. The other part of determining whether you can fail or not is this issue of seasonal high groundwater. I don't know if you know it or not, but groundwater varies based on the season. In the fall, when the trees start to lose their leaves, the water in the ground starts to come up. As all summer long, the trees have been sucking the water out of the ground. So by May, when the leaves start to leaf out again, the trees start to leaf out again, the water goes down. But by the 1st of May or so, the groundwater is at its highest. And groundwater, when it varies, leaves staining in the soils, and that's what a soil evaluator looks for. Again, as I said earlier, back in the day, they used to do the soil testing in August and September when the groundwater was low. Some soils, that groundwater can vary as much as 15 feet. Others, if you're near a wetland, some places down in the Queens, which was mostly disturbed, the variation there might be only 2 or 3 feet. That's why a lot of the houses, for instance, in the Queens, are either slabs or the foundation's only 2 or 3 feet below grade. For those houses where the sewer pipe comes out at that lowest point, goes into a leach field, that leach field is typically 2 or 3 feet below grade, that septic system is likely in the groundwater. And so we're finding a lot of those fail. Cesspools, although they're not illegal in Holliston yet, a lot of towns have set by regulation that cesspools are automatically failed. I don't know if there's too many left here in Holliston. We see them once in a while. Typically, when water came to town, people abandoned their wells and then turned the pipe and put it in the old well. So those are obviously going to be in the groundwater because they were groundwater wells. Okay, let's go to the next one. So DEP encourages you to shop around when it comes time to asking for a Title V inspection. And it makes sense, but in a small town like this, we have 2 or 3 pumpers that I'm sure you all know and trust. You may want to stay with them, at least give them the opportunity to give you a proposal. If you want to shop around, that's fine. It's often hard for them to even give you a proposal without knowing any details on the system. Sometimes they have to come out with a backhoe and do some digging just to find the distribution box, especially if, and I've come across a few people in town who have never pumped their septic, 20 years, 30 years, figuring, leave it alone, it ain't broke, I'm not fixing it. So if there's no way to find out where it is other than start with a pipe in the basement, it could be a fairly expensive operation and a lot of disturbance. Again, the professionals, engineers, registered sanitarians, and certified health officers. Next slide. Again, more of the shopping around idea. I don't know of anybody who gives written estimates, but I would suggest to you that when you do get a Title V inspection, be home for it. Be out there with them when they dig. Make them show you what they're finding. Be there when they pump the septic tank. You don't necessarily have to pump a septic tank for a Title V inspection either. The other thing that I wanted to point out to you, because there's a lot of fear that, oh boy, I have my septic system inspected, it fails. Now the Board of Health's going to know, and I'm going to fix it. I'm going to have to fix it, and I don't have the money. There's what's called an informal Title V inspection. So you can tell the inspector, I want an informal inspection, I just want to know if it's going to pass or not. So they'll come out and do everything except complete the paperwork and turn it in. It should be less money than a formal one, but you're going to find out whether it's good news or bad news. And if in the process of doing it, he tells you or she tells you that it's working fine, okay, let's go all the way and get it done. If you fail and a report is turned in, you have 2 years, according to the regulations, to replace it, or the Board of Health is going to be knocking on your door. If it's a really bad problem and you have breakout on the ground and your neighbor calls, then you're going to get an enforcement letter, and you're going to be fixing it a lot sooner rather than later. You may even be forced to.
So if it fails, you have 2 years?
Yes, if it fails, if the inspector turns in a failing Title V report to the Board of Health, then you have 2 years under the regulations to replace it.
Is that the informal or the formal?
The formal, yeah.
What about the informal?
The informal, nobody has to know about it but you and your inspector. So next slide. So if the news is bad and you have to replace your septic, then you start getting involved with engineers. That's even worse than working with inspectors. But there are plenty around that do this sort of work. The Board of Health has a list of people who work in town and are approved to do it, just as they have a list for Title V inspectors as well. So you can check with the Board of Health. They also have some handout information for you to help you through the process. And we're getting now to the part that I really think is a shame, is that a lot of people are giving up the $6,000 rebate. It's $6,000 off your Massachusetts income taxes. So it's real money. It's not off your income to reduce your income. It's real $6,000. It works out to be $1,500 a year for 4 years, and not more than 40% of the cost of the septic, which means a septic system all in, if it's costing you about $25,000, you'll get that $6,000 back. And I think we've found that on average, the cost of a septic system, the construction cost, is between $22,000 and $25,000 here in Holliston. If you have to do a pump because of a mounted situation, it can be as much as $30,000. And then when you add in all the soft costs for testing, engineering, and Board of Health fees, you're going to spend another $5,000.
If it's just a leach field?
Well, if it's a good question, because If it's just a distribution box that's bad, you get what's called a conditional pass. And the Board of Health and the state will let you replace that distribution box. That's $1,500, $2,000. If the tank is cracked and leaking, you can replace a septic tank. The new tanks are 1,500 gallons. They're about $1,200 plus $1,000 or so to install it, so you're going to spend another $25. But if the leach field fails, then it can't be repaired. Then everything has to be brought up to code. So if you have a perfectly good septic tank that's only 1,000 gallons, it's not according to the current codes, which is a minimum 1,500. So you're replacing that, you're replacing the distribution box, and you're also evaluating where the groundwater is. So you could end up with a 4-foot mound in the backyard. So leaching fields, I'm glad you asked that, because leaching fields isn't enough. Yes?
Do you have to still own the house to get the $6,000 rebate?
The question is, do you still have to own the house to get the $6,000 rebate? You have to be the person of record on the house. So if you buy a house with a failed system and put it in yourself while you're living there, then you qualify.
But you say you get that rebate over 4 years, right? So if you sell the house within 4 years, are you still able to get that rebate?
So the question is, if you qualify for the rebate and you're there 2 years and you collect $3,000, are you still eligible for the other 2 years? The answer is no. Yes?
So this isn't a rebate, it's a tax credit, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so what it is if you replace the system this year, 2019, and you get a certificate of compliance from the Board of Health, when you do your taxes next year for 2019, you can subtract $1,500 from the state taxes that you owe.
So over 4 years, if you don't use it, you lose it.
That's right. If you don't use it, you lose it.
You don't pay it.
I know that one of the reasons some people don't want to replace their septic is because they see their neighbors next door has replaced one, and there's this 4-foot mound and an ugly pipe, and you just don't want to destroy your yard, lose your garden. The question was, if you've lived in your house for 40 years and you go to sell it, then her understanding is you have to replace the septic system no matter what. And that's not the case. No. The next part of this presentation, I believe, was to explain a little about innovative alternative technologies. If the groundwater is high and you're going to end up with a mound, you can choose to have what's called a mound reduction system. There are 2 kinds. There's active and there's passive. The passive ones, there are some leaching fields that actually provide a level of pretreatment. So the state says if you elect for this type of system, instead of being 4 feet above groundwater, your system can be 2 feet above groundwater. So that eliminates 2 feet of mound right there. And then there are systems where the leaching field itself consists of basically irrigation tubing. So the leaching field now is 5/8 of an inch tall instead of 2 feet tall. So now you end up with eliminating 4 feet of mound, which is usually enough to eliminate a mound and preserve your yard. The other good thing about these alternative systems, the drip line ones, is that it can go around trees, bushes, it can go under driveways. It's really pretty nice. So it really reduces the impact. The systems that require, if you go to the 4-foot reduction one, that's called an active system. Basically, you're building a wastewater treatment plant inside the septic tank, and because you're discharging wastewater that's now 95% clean, the state lets you put it closer to groundwater. The downside is there are mechanical systems that are running all the time. The electric bill to run one of these is typically $35, $40 a month, and then the manufacturer of the system comes out twice to sometimes 3 times a year, and that'll cost you another $500 a year to own it. There's a bunch of them in Holliston. We do a lot of them in Sherburne and Dover. I mean, if you're paying $4 million for a house, that's really nothing to keep the yard. The question is, does the 2-foot reduced mound system cost more than the 4-foot standard 4-foot system? The answer is no. It's typically less money. And the 4-foot reduced one can actually cost less than the 2-foot, and definitely less than the 4-foot initially, because on small yards you might have to build retaining walls all the way around the system to keep it in, and that can be very expensive. But the problem with the 4-foot reduced one, the annual cost of owning it is about $1,000 a year. So again, like I said, there's plenty in Holliston, and I've probably done 300 of them within the region. And the cost of maintenance is coming down. It used to be $500. Now there are other people getting in the business, so it's down to like $300. And hopefully it'll get reduced even more. If you're down the Cape building, the Cape is a confined aquifer. Just about everybody on the Cape is required to have one of those systems. Did you get to the IA pictures? So the IA systems I was talking about, you see the one on the left, that's just installed now with the drip lines. And the one on the right, that's actually my yard. I didn't want to have a 4-foot mounded retaining wall, so this reduces it, and underneath the garden are those drip lines, and they water the garden. And then I've got one more. This was a rather large system we did for the Unitarian Church in Sherburne. That's the way it looked before we started, and that's the way it looks now. Otherwise, there'd have been retaining walls. It would have been devastating to this property. The question is, if you're abutting conservation land, is it more expensive to replace your septic system? First of all, if you're within 100 feet of the wetlands, then you're going to be dealing with the Conservation Commission, which by definition is expensive. But it probably also means that the groundwater is high, which means you're going to have a mound and maybe some retaining walls. The other thing we look to do, though, when you've got a failed leaching field, the state considers that soil as contaminated earth. So rather than put the replacement in the same place, dig that out, and have you pay $75 a yard to haul it away, we try to find another place to put it. After 6 months or a year, that contaminated soil, the viruses die, the bacteria die, it just becomes dirt. So you wouldn't put it in the same place. Like, for instance, if you had your backyard abutted a wetland, if there was room, the recommendation would be to put it out front to stay away from Conservation Commission. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want the Conservation Commission walking around your yard. You'll find a lot of people use that area, that wet area back there, to get rid of their leaves, their brush. Conservation Commission sees that. They're going to add the removal of that to the cost of the notice of intent, which requires a wetlands biologist, a public hearing, a whole bunch of fees. That can add $3,000 to $4,000 to the cost. So after you've failed, the engineer you hire will look at all of those things and advise you accordingly. Question is, what happens if you've got a system that has a pump and the power goes out? Title V requires that pump chamber, which is usually a second tank after the septic tank, has enough capacity in it to hold all the wastewater from the house at a given design flow. Let's say you're a 3-bedroom house. It's designed to have a reserve area of 330 gallons a day. So if the power's out for a day, you can generate as much as 330 gallons and not have a problem. Typically, that's a real high number. That assumes 6 people living in the house. Anything less than that, and your day's storage is probably going to go to 2 days or 3 days. And
What's the purpose of a wall?
the question is, what's the purpose of the wall? I described a wall earlier. If your system is mounded up, say 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, and you have limited area, you're required to keep the soil within your property, within 5 feet of the property line. And if let's say you're up 4 feet, you have to go out, and your system is 20 by 40, say. From that 20-foot sideline, you have to go out another 15 feet, and then a minimum slope of 3 to 1. That's another 12 feet on both sides. Now you're looking at a system that's maybe 60 or 70 feet wide. If you don't have the room for that without going on your neighbor's property, then you have to put a retaining wall in to keep it closer. So it looks lousy, but it serves the purpose of maintaining that mound within your own property. So the question is, how long does it take to install a septic? After you've been found guilty, you've gone through the design process, you have hired a contractor, he shows up about a month and a half later. The whole process typically takes a couple of months to get an approved plan, takes another month or two to get a contractor to agree to do it, but typically it takes about 10 days to do the installation, and you're almost never without use of the house. Depending on the logistics, they'll either replace the septic system, the leach field, while you're living on the tank. They'll pump the tank first, or they might replace the tank and then your wastewater will go into the tank while they're building the leach field. So you're never out of the house because of an install. Question is, what happens if you've followed all the rules, you've replaced the septic, and in 20 years it fails?
Less than 20 years.
Less than 20.
And there's only
15.
There's 2 people living in the house.
Yeah. The liability is entirely on the homeowner. So the question is, how long is a Title V inspection good for? They're good for 2 years. If you don't pump your tank, if within that 2-year period you pump it, then they're good for 3 years. But I think you'll find buyers. Well, you don't get your money back for an inspection. The comment is that I'm thinking of moving in 3 years. I have my tank pumped regularly. It's due to be pumped anytime now. Should I ask for an informal inspection? If it were me, I would. Because if you find out it's not going to pass, then at least you'll get 2 to 3 years of rebate. Question is, gray water systems like washing machines, they have to be connected. In the old days, probably there's a lot of houses around still that have a separate wet well, maybe an old well on the property, and it goes to that. But if a Title V inspector comes in, inspects your system, and he finds that you've got the washing machine going to a separate facility, like a dry well, that separate facility also has to pass the Title V inspection criteria. If it doesn't, you can't just say, okay, well, I'll connect it over and I'll pass you. And I believe, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, the Board of Health may say, well, you can connect it over, but now you've got to wait 6 months to see if it's going to function with all that additional water into the old one. Is that right, Scott?
That's correct.
Yeah, so Scott confirmed that. Vernon's question is, if you use latex paint or oil-based paint or stains and you got some dirty brushes, if you wash that down the sink, you're going to affect your septic system.
Then how do you suggest one do that?
Buy cheap brushes and wrap them up and throw them away. Question is, are additive products like Rid-X of any value? In the Title V regulations, the state actually allows certain additives, which tells you that they're worthless. Right? There are actually some pumpers who push those, and my understanding is drivers don't keep their jobs if they don't meet their quota, but they're totally useless. If anything, they tend to break up the solids, put them into the solution, and then they go out into the leach field and plug up the leach field. So you want those solids. If you listen to the ads, they talk about how if you dump this down the toilet, your septic tank will be clean as a whistle, but your leach field won't. Yeah, the question is, does it apply to things like Drano? Drano typically is used for unplugging a trap. Again, if you just use it once or twice, and you're using a lot of water anyway, there's probably no problem. It's a little hard on the plumbing especially in old houses that are cast iron. But I don't think the house cleaning agents will do that. But Drano is you do it once or twice, it's not going to be the end of the world.
Twice a year, a month.
What about baby wipes? Those things don't break down, at least not initially, so they tend to plug. They gather in the septic tank. I mean, if you want to pump your septic tank every 6 months, then by all means, but those are better in the trash. Which reminds me, we actually have a client that has been nursing a bad septic system for probably 10 years. And we just found out, they finally decided to go forward, and they told us for the last 3 years, they were so concerned about their leach field breaking out that they put the toilet paper in the trash. So if you can imagine living like that for 3 years. So the question is, if you have a system that's 20 or 30 years old and you pump it every 2 years, what else should you be doing? There really isn't anything you can do other than, if it's only 20 years old, the state now allows what's called an effluent filter. And your pumper, most of them can install that filter in the outlet of the tank, and it's basically it's a screen. And so that keeps even the fine solids that are in suspension. You run a dishwasher of 20 gallons, you stir everything up, you're going to get some solids out. But these filters will keep that in the tank. And then when he pumps the tank, the plastic, he just shakes it, it comes clean, and you put it back in. So that's about the only thing you can do. The other thing is, try not to do all 5 loads of laundry on the same day. It's better to spread water use out if you can. And then, of course, over the leach field itself, you have to be careful with that. Don't drive on it, don't drop a tree on it, all those sorts of things.
Are there a lot of failures around?
So the question is, are there a lot of failures? The Board of Health sees more of them than I do. What would you say a year we're getting? Scott says that last year there were 200 system repairs in Holliston. Question is, what if you live in an area of high groundwater?
On Chamberlain Street.
Yeah, typically when you have your system pumped and you ask your pumper, how's it look? He'll say it looks fine. He hasn't gotten into the distribution box yet. But one interesting thing to notice is that if your system is in the high groundwater, and every year that groundwater comes up, flushes out the system, and it goes back down. So it takes care of some of the problem of plugging in the leach field. So it tends to last longer. But the problem is when the inspector finds out that you're in the groundwater, then you're going to fail. So I can't tell you how many people have said to me, my system's always worked fine. I don't understand how I could have failed. And it's usually because you're in the groundwater. So the question is, if your home and septic is over 50 years old, are you pretty much on borrowed time? Probably, yeah. Yep, I mean, I've seen them, I haven't seen too many pass that were 50 years old, but some of that are still working after 50 years. So the question is, I have a 1,000-gallon tank and a 500-gallon tank. Can that suffice? And the answer is yes. Unless you have a 5-bedroom house, then you need a 2,000-gallon tank. But a 1,500-gallon tank will take care of up to 4 bedrooms under the current regs. Right. Yeah, the question is, can a distribution box shift? So we showed earlier on that, on one of the slides, you had a distribution box. Water comes in from the septic tank, and the distribution box is designed to spread the water evenly out over 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes. That box can shift either because you had some work done in the yard, somebody drove over it, tilted it. It only takes moving that box less than a half an inch, and all the water is going to go out 1 hole instead of 3. So now you've overloaded the 1 hole, the system, you get a Title V inspection, he comes out and he looks, pours a little water in, 2 holes are taking water and the 3rd one isn't, you failed. So yeah, it can move. Under the new regulations, Holliston allows what's called flow equalizers. It's a plastic insert. So they put the box in, they put these inserts in. It's basically a little wear configuration. And if the box moves a little, these things will make up for that, so it'll stay distributing the wastewater evenly. Do the large, heavy commercial lawnmowers cause any harm to a septic system? They really don't. Yeah, they're fine. Usually the leach field is at least a foot below grade, sometimes more. The question is, can you, is it illegal to take the waste line from your washer machine and just run it out on the ground? Scott, you want to answer that?
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.